Ohio State University accounting professor Brian Mittendorf on whether the NRA's finances show signs of a turnaround. That and more on this episode of the Weekly Reload Podcast.
No, the devil's got no hold on me.
All right, welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to another episode of the Weekly Reload Podcast. I'm your host, Stephen Gutowski. I'm also a CNN contributor and the founder of thereload.com, where you can head over and sign up for our free newsletter today if you want to keep up to date with what's going on with guns in America from a sober, serious perspective that focuses on hard news and analysis over opinion and bloviating. This week, we are talking about the National Rifle Association and their latest financial reports, which I have here with me, from this year's NRA annual meeting that I was at in Atlanta over last weekend. And to do that, we have with us Ohio State University professor of accounting, Brian Mittendorf, who has been following the NRA's finances for quite a while now, and I think can give us a good deal of insight into what exactly this report shows. So, welcome to the show. Brian, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me back.
Yeah, absolutely. And just for anyone who doesn't know, can you just give them a little bit about your background?
Sure. My background is in accounting. And, I'm an accountant and teach and research in accounting, particularly focused on nonprofit organizations. And so I've, as you mentioned, I've followed the NRA over the years. Due to its prominence, I always kind of keep an eye on where their finances are and have seen the ups and downs over the years. And so have followed them due to their prominence in the nonprofit world, not necessarily on the gun side. So,
yeah. Yes, obviously your interest is in the nonprofit, the NRA as a national nonprofit entity and its finances and its accounting and not so much on the political or not even non-political gun stuff. So that's why we want to have you on, so we can get some of your expertise. And you have looked over this report. And let's just start with the broad strokes. What are you seeing in this 2024? And this is from last year, right? This 2024 annual report. What are you seeing overall for the NRA right now?
I guess it depends on whether you want to take the glass half full or glass half empty approach for them. But let's start with the glass half empty from their standpoint, which is this organization has been shrinking for several years now. Their budget, particularly spending on core programs, has shrunk quite substantially over the years, and that continued again. Their legal costs have been really high in recent years. That was the case again. Their financial cushion has been pretty thin. That's the case again. So, if you want to say they've been kind of on this downward slope, it's still kind of on the downward slope. On the glass half full side, I would say that it seems to be leveling off in many ways. So the declines aren't as substantial as they've been in the past, both on the revenue and expense side. And so maybe they're approaching that low watermark in terms of what their size can be. And then I know we've talked about this already outside of this discussion, but the other piece, which is kind of unique to them is, if I say they're at a low watermark and they're going to be, it's not necessarily that they're permanently there, because the organization has incurred all those legal expenses. And really, if they were to shore up that money, they would have a lot more money to spend. So, from their standpoint, there's some silver lining here in the finances. It seems like they're kind of approaching that low watermark, and it seems like there's some things they can build on.
Yeah. So, like you said, I think you could to look at it two ways. They're still declining. They're still shrinking, but they're not shrinking and declining as fast as they used to be. Just to put some numbers to it, the report shows the NRA brought in $51.7 million in membership dues in 2024. Now that's down from $61.8 million the year before. However, that's a 16.3% decline. The year before, they had a 25.7% decline in membership dues. So the rate has slowed. It's still substantial. 16% decline in membership dues is not a positive thing, but it's less than it was. The NRA raised a total of $223.9 million and spent $233.7 million. So they're in the red again. But that was also better than 2023. Like they weren't as far in the red this time around as they were last time. And so I guess those are the signs of improvement. Although I guess to put it back in context, like you said, if you go back and look at an older report like this one from 2018, what you'll find is the group that year brought in $170.3 million in membership dues and $412 million in overall revenue. It still landed in the red. It seems the NRA has had a habit of operating in the red, spending more than it brings in for quite a while now. But they did manage to spend $423 million that year, which just completely dwarfs the NRA of today. Dues are about a third of what they used to be, and spending is about a half. So, I don't know. But at the same time, like you said, there's positive signs. The rate of decline is slower. And, one of the reasons for that, I think, is the financials, the legal spending, as you alluded to, has been so substantial over the last 6 years because of this corruption scandal that they've been engrossed in, with their former executive vice president, Wayne LaPierre, and him being found liable by a jury for diverting millions of dollars of NRA funds towards personal expenses. They've spent something like $200 million on legal fees, in particular to one law firm, over that time. And I guess, was there any change there on that detail in this latest report?
Maybe a little. I think the legal expenses might have gone down some, not a huge amount, but I think what we see in the report is kind of those green shoots of the legal expenses could go down a lot very quickly. If we look back to that 2016, 2017, 2018 period, we're talking, 6 to 12 million legal expenses a year. Whereas now they're talking 45 to 50 or 40 to 50 million in legal expenses a year. And that is for an organization that is now half the size as it was back then. That is an unbelievable difference. And if they can settle into a new norm where they incur legal costs that are part of the day-to-day life of a nonprofit of their size, and they got down to even that 10 million mark, which is not it's not a very small amount of legal expenses, but it's a fourth of what they spend right now. The thought of shoring up $30 million like that, an organization that's been shrinking, to just suddenly have access to $30 million or more dollars, that would be the silver lining to me, that they really do have an opportunity to start building up what they do in terms of spending before convincing members to come back. And spending more helps members come back. And so, it's the chicken or egg problem, just like they were on this spiral of losing members and having to cutting back spending and losing members and having to cut back spending. If they can reverse that spiral by spending more on membership programs, it's going to be easier for them to get members back.
Yeah. So just to give some numbers on the legal expenses. Now, the way they categorize this is legal, audit, and taxes. So this isn't all legal expenses necessarily, right, but this is how they count it. In 2023, they had spent upwards of $54 million in that category, almost entirely in what they call admin legal expenses. So very, very likely the New York litigation of the corruption lawsuit. And that was their top line item of everything. They didn't spend more on any other single thing. They spent less on salaries and benefits for staff. They spent less on, member communications. They're very the core programs, as you alluded to, professional services, their legislative programs. They only spent, for instance, 18 million on legislative programs in 2023, whereas they spent 54 million on legal fees, legal audit and taxes. Then in 2024, it did come down and significantly, right? 45.5 million. So it's still a lot, but not 54 million, right?
Right.
And, that was still almost all within the admin section. So 40 million of that was in admin. And it wasn't actually the top line item anymore. By a small margin, the NRA actually spent more on professional services and, salaries and benefits for staff. So I guess you might call that like incremental improvement in that area, right?
Yeah. And I mean, I guess that's the message for most of this financial statement. Like all the things which were problems for them over the last few years have improved a little bit. Not enough to say that, everything's turned around. But like I said, I think that they're, in early indicators that things certainly can turn around. Now, by what turnaround means is another question. Will they return to the size they once were? That's a really uphill climb. But will they grow again? That seems very likely.
Yeah, and to drill down even further, I guess on the legal stuff, we do have a compliance report that they handed out at the members meeting as well, which shows their top outside contractors, and by far their top outside contractor, again, and this has been the case for years now, was Brewer Attorneys and Counselors. This is the outside firm that has handled their legal strategy during this corruption scandal. They were the ones, who advocated for the group to try to file bankruptcy to avoid the New York case. It didn't work. They come up with a lot of the legal defenses and represented them in court throughout that New York trial, which has cost the NRA a lot of money. And they, in 2024, accounted for $32.2 million worth of spending explicitly on legal services. So, how much of the other, that overall number is also legal services is not entirely clear, but that number is what went to the Brewer firm. And I believe that some of that at least is probably caught in the $200 million estimate that was previously reported on how much has been spent by the NRA at the Brewer firm over the last, half decade plus now. So, just to give people an idea that that's where a lot of that legal spending ended up, is in this firm. And they dealt mostly with that New York case, though there were several other cases going on as well with other, Ackerman McQueen, for instance. They had long running dueling lawsuits with them that they had to settle. But that's where a lot of that money went. And I think that's what you're saying is like, this is where they have a real opportunity to convert that spending into spending that might attract new members, right?
Right. Either directly on trying to attract members or on spending on the programs that members see and value and, feel the benefits of that spending. And I'm not to say that the legal spending wasn't appropriate. That's a different question, I think.
Sure,
but they were in a circumstance where they
that's
had
a debate internally.
Legal costs. And I don't know whether there's an appropriate amount, but it certainly isn't something that day-to-day members were feeling like it was something they're getting from the organization. Again, whether the organization should have spent that is a completely different question. But if that money is freed up so they can spend it on more member events, education events, training, conferences, things that are much more directly related to the member experience, then, it opens the possibility that they can bring back some of those lapsed members. And of course, that's ultimately what the organization wants to do is return to its previous size. Whether it can get bigger, back to that point, right? I don't know, but whether it can grow, that seems like a very reasonable thing to expect in 2025 because of the way the financials are set up. I mean, one thing I should mention, and we can get to this if you want, as you noted, like membership revenues are a third of what they used to be, and expenses are half of what they used to be. Part of that is because they've shrunk quite a bit and they've lost members.
Yes.
But
millions of members.
They have not lost 2/3 of their membership either. Arguably, some of those previous numbers were higher than what you would expect for this organization. So they were spending really, I mean, part of the problems they got into is they were spending probably more than they had the capacity to spend for several years. And on the membership revenue side, not to get too into the accounting weeds, but the membership revenue that they recognize, if they have a multi-year membership, a lot of that revenue can get recognized in the early years of those memberships.
Right.
So when they were signing up multi-year and lifetime members, a lot of that was being accelerated as revenue to them on the financial statements. But it doesn't mean they lost those members. Some of them they did, like you said, but it doesn't mean they lost all those members, but they might be losing the dues that those members would be paying because they already paid for multi-year memberships. And like I said, that's a little bit into the weeds, but I didn't want to create an impression that the membership is a third of what it used to be, because I don't think that's the case.
It doesn't appear to be. Yeah, they've lost several million at most, but they should probably still be closer to about 2/3 the size in membership than they did, even at the lowest estimates that we've seen. But because we don't know for sure, it's not public information how many members the NRA has. But there are estimates out there, and they're the latest I've seen is somewhere between 3 and 4 million, when they used to be at 5.5 or so million. So they have lost a lot, but to your point, they haven't. The dues declining by far more than that doesn't necessarily. There's other reasons why that might have happened other than just losing membership. Because you're right, and they did spend a long time sort of upselling your annual member into a lifetime membership. And one of the problems from an accounting standpoint, a financial standpoint of doing that is how you recognize that money. And if you recognize that life membership all at once, then that donor isn't a donor anymore and they become a liability, because you still have to service them. You still have to give them their membership benefits, but they don't have to give you any money anymore. Now, many of them may in the form of contributions, but that's a different question. But just back to the legal side real quick, because there's what we have in these reports, 2024, which cover last year, right? And then there's a little more information we have beyond what's in these written reports, right? That maybe backs up what I think your theory of why they have an opportunity here. Because one, as I just mentioned, Brewer has been the top outside contractor for years and really way above everyone else. For instance, in 2024, the number 2 outside contractor was Membership Advisors Fundraising, which is, as the name implies, a fundraising group company that they work with. They spent $8.4 million on them, so far less than the $32 million they spent on the outside law firm. And that since the end of 2024, the Brewer firm no longer represents the NRA. They cut ties with them. It was one of the internal fights among NRA leadership. And, when the New York trial concluded, which is another thing that happened, right? The New York trial is over now. They don't need to necessarily incur nearly as much expense in litigating that trial as they did even just last year in 2024. And then also the law firm that they've been paying quite a lot of money to do that, they're no longer working with. And we have some insight into what that's done for their legal expenses. Because like like we just talked about, the 2024 numbers a little bit better than 2023 numbers, about $9 million less that they spent in that category, but still their third biggest expense overall and still in the $45+ million range. Doug Hamlin, who's the executive vice president of the NRA, he replaced Wayne LaPierre after LaPierre resigned in early 2024. He said at the members meeting that their legal expenses had gone from 15 million in the first quarter of 2024, which is reflected in these reports that we have, down to just 685,000 in the first quarter of 2025, which isn't reflected in these reports, but is something he said directly. So, I mean, that sure implies that they're going to have a whole lot more space to use those funds without having to raise more money from membership. And they can, I mean, if that trend holds, they're going to be spending less on legal fees than at any time during this whole scandal, right?
Yeah. For many years since we've seen that low of legal, that when you annualize that low of legal amount. Yeah. Now, even if that's not sustainable at that rate, even if it's sustained at twice that rate, it's still an enormous decline in spending. And, to think of an organization with a budget that size, their most recent year, but their budget was around between $200 and $250 million, to suddenly say you've got an extra 10% in your budget, free extra $25 million is, it's a rarity that an organization would have that. And again, I know they've had a lot of challenges over the years, so it's weird to say they're in a good position. But after several years of just all the financial news was bad, you see some signs for them which indicate they have much more flexibility than they've ever had, or since they've had since this
all started. Yeah. Because that implies, I mean, you could have upwards of $40 million to move to other priorities. If they're really spending, 685, that's what, less than 3 million in a year, or around 3 million, or sorry, less than 4 million. Let's say that.
Yeah.
Just very quick off the top of my head math, certainly less than 4 million. And they spent 45 million last year on, now that wasn't all legal. There is some, I guess we should talk about this real quick. But it implies that there's a lot of money to open up here. I think it gets a little fuzzy when you try to look at the numbers in here compared to what Doug Hamlin was talking about just how they don't completely match up with the outside contractor number, because not everything in here is going to legal expenses. Like I said, it's legal, audit, and taxes. So there's some wiggle room there as to what that breakdown is. And Hamlin may just be talking about like one section of the NRA's legal spending, because that's the other thing about these reports that I think we should address, right? That maybe you can explain to people. This is not, I mean, first off, I guess, what is the NRA? Because everybody thinks of the NRA as and most major political organizations as one entity, but it's not really, right?
Yeah, and I think the footnotes in that financial statement will go in depth on this, but it's a collection of organizations. The NRA, what I always say is the NRA is a membership organization. It's a 501c4 membership organization, but there's affiliated charities, 501c3 charities, the largest, the NRA Foundation, and then there's much more expressly political organizations that are involved as well. So it's a collection of all these entities. I think people often think of the NRA, meaning the membership organization, kind of interchangeably with this collection of entities, but they're not exactly interchangeable, to your point. So the financial statements, you have access to, those reflect the collection of entities. So, and there's several. I forget whether it's 6 or 7, but
there's 7.
There's 7. Okay, so but in terms of big dollar amounts, I would say that the two to really focus on is the NRA membership organization, the 501c4, which we can kind of think of as the parent here, and then the NRA Foundation, which you can kind of think of as the offspring of the NRA. And it's an interesting situation. The 501c4 is really the one that's had the financial difficulty. The NRA Foundation has really been in a strong financial position for a long time. So when we see the financial statements that combine these together, it creates the impression that it's one big pot of money, but it's not. It's separate pots of money.
Right, exactly. And that's one of the limitations of this report. Even though we get it every year and we can compare apples to apples in that sense, what these numbers are representing is all of those NRA entities together, and that can hide some struggles in some areas, because, like you said, the NRA Foundation is a 501c3, as you mentioned, which means that people can donate, and their donations are tax deductible, and so people are more inclined to give to the NRA Foundation. It's also less controversial, right? Because the NRA Foundation focuses on the non-political stuff, the training, and safety, and education, competition, shooting, the things that don't deal with politics as much, right? Certainly. And you see that a lot with these kinds of organizations, right? They tend to have a non-political arm and then a political arm. And even the political arm, like the advocacy arm, gets split up because of tax laws, right? Like,
yeah, some much more expressly political activity is going to be done by the 527 organization, which is affiliated. And so like you said, I think the thing that kind of gets lost in the weeds maybe with this financial statement is that their overall financial position looks pretty good, but a lot of that's driven by the NRA Foundation, which has had a really good financial position. And it's the NRA membership organization, which has struggled over the years, and why you're focusing on membership revenue, because that's the money that's most flexible. The money that's coming from donors is often restricted by those donors for particular things. And even if it's not, if it's going into the foundation, to your point, it's legally restricted as to what it can be used for. It has to be used for that charitable purpose. So it's used for training, education, safety, and not more political things. And so, yeah, not to pull a reference from Arrested Development, but it's like the money in the banana stand thing. The NRA Foundation has always had that money, and the NRA has struggled. But the NRA can't just pull that money from the foundation, and so
not legally, at least.
Yeah. And so that I guess was part of the legal challenges that they faced from the Washington D.C. was whether the accusation that some of the money was being pushed towards the NRA from the foundation, and that was an accusation there.
And they had a settlement with the DC Attorney General over that. And actually, they're still alive. They're not totally out of the woods on their legal troubles yet. In fact, there's still a live case from NRA donors to the foundation. That's headed up by, it's a class action suit headed up by a guy named David Delacoya, who donated like six figures to the NRA Foundation. And the lawsuit accuses the foundation of funneling money to the NRA, which then was used by LaPierre on personal expenses. And so that's still a live case. It's all of its claims actually survived recent court rulings, so that they still have a number of legal exposures that could affect them financially. In fact, they talk about a bunch of them right in this report at the end. They kind of give their sort of like I guess in an earnings call, a corporation would give out their potential liabilities that they're facing, and they do that in this report with all
that in their financial report. Yeah,
all the different lawsuits, whether it was the New York case, the DC case, the Akron McQueen case. There's like 6 or 7 of them in here. Now, some of these are finalized, like the New York case, but not all of them are, I guess. And so there's still some risk there, right?
Yeah, and I should clarify. I don't want to make it sound like there's a lot of money in the foundation and the NRA doesn't have much funds at all, and there's no way money can flow, because money can flow legally from one to the other. To your point,
the rent
if the NRA is conducting educational programs, they can receive a grant from the NRA Foundation to conduct those programs, and so it's just that money can't freely flow. So the NRA can't say, anything we can spend money on, we can get that money from the NRA Foundation. And so it's an organization that, like, the big picture, their financials still look pretty good. And actually, big picture, have looked okay during these years. The problem is the money that they have that's at their disposal is quite restricted in what they can do with it. And so, that these consolidated financial statements that bring the whole bucket of organizations together, we do miss out a little bit on what that membership organization has at its disposal, because that's the more freely spendable money. But as you noted, membership revenues are way down. And so to the extent the organization has shrunk, that's where it's shrinking in the pot of money that's much more flexible.
What about contributions? Because contributions were actually up in 2024. How should we view those compared to like members' dues?
This is where it's going to be much more helpful to see where those contributions went, because what we have is the consolidated financial statements, and so I'm just looking at their member dues. Their contributions in 2024. Mm-hmm. They like you said, they were up. Even the ones that donors didn't restrict were up, and those things all sound positive for them, because money that comes in that donors restrict is perfectly good money to have for the organization, but it is more restricted by nature. Money that comes in without donor restrictions has much more flexibility for the organization. The open question I have, though, would be that those donations coming in, those contributions coming in, how much of them are coming into the 501c3 foundation? Because like you said, the foundation, it has the advantage. It can attract donations much easier because they can offer a tax deduction for those donations. So if all of those donations are going into the 501c3, that money is not freely used by the collective, right? And I don't know that split, but it's certainly it's good news for them regardless. The question is how much money does it free up for them? If they had membership revenue going up, that would be kind of unequivocally the membership organization is better off from it.
So in these numbers, it's much easier to tell what membership dues are doing than it is contributions. Contributions are still harder to read just because they could be going to any of these 7 different entities.
Yeah, and they're consolidating them together. Now, the organization knows their Form 990 financials, when they're disclosed, will have that split. It's just not publicly available. At least I haven't seen them.
And the 990s, we don't usually get those until a while after they've been filed.
At least publicly, I tend to not see them till November. So, they're due 15th day of the 5th month, and then they can get a 6-month extension. And the NRA, they're not unusual in this. They typically get the extension. And so we tend to see them in November. But again, I'm not saying you should read anything into the delay. A lot of organizations do that. But it just means we don't get those details till later, at least publicly. Of course, they know them at this point. And so they could say more about that split for sure. But the split, I guess, bottom line is the split matters. Where the money's flowing in does matter to the organization as a whole, because the foundation has historically had plenty of money to do their operations. And the NRA membership organization is the one that's been more short on funds. And so, the more they can generate funds on that side, the more flexibility they'll have.
That makes sense. Yeah. Now, if you look at a little more detail here, it does seem like the NRA was able to increase its spending, political spending, during the 2024, which you would hope that would be the case because it's a presidential election year. But certainly not anywhere near the levels that it was back in 2016 or even 2020, right? I mean, they went from 18.7 million on legislative programs, which also, of course, includes like staff salary. Not all of this is directly in like ad spending or anything like that, but they did increase it to 31.7 million. So, not quite double from 2023, but you can certainly see the effect of the political campaign on their expenditures in here, right?
Yeah, and again, it's hard to separate, how much of this is driven by the political season as opposed to how much is driven by they had a lot more money at their disposal. But again, if I were in their shoes, I would say that nonetheless, it's a good sign for them, that they had the capacity to spend more, because things had been spiraling in such a bad direction for them financially. The fact that they had the capacity to increase their spending would indicate that, it's not as bad as it could be.
Right.
And again, it seems like a lot of the signs out there that they've kind of hit the low point, and they've also the non-financial stuff we've seen changes too. So there's a story they can tell, like we're a different organization than we were. And I certainly can't speak to whether the new leadership is different or whether it's substantively different organization, but at least it's not the exact same organization than it was, and so they can kind of repitch the story of who they are.
Right. Which they are doing, right? That is something they've tried to do. Although the compliance report here does have signs of some of those old problems that have been at the core of the scandal, right? I mean, for one, and to be fair, these are early 2024, but they were still spending on private jets. They spent $55,683 on 2 charter jet trips, flights between Texas and New Jersey for Wayne LaPierre when he was briefly still the executive vice president before he resigned ahead of the jury finding that he was liable for paying back millions of dollars to the NRA. They did spend $55,000 on 2 flights for him, and then in May they spent another $26,000 on a single flight from Dallas to New York for an unidentified keynote speaker at a women's leadership forum event that they hosted. So, and in addition to that, there was they did spend another $110,000 on paying one of their board members, Marion Hammer, again early in 2024, because that they also note that that contract was cut off. All this stuff happened, I believe, before Doug Hamlin became the executive vice president. So that stuff is still there. Some of these lingering issues that really were at the core of this half-decade plus corruption scandal. You do still see that, not as much of it, but it is, the remnants are still there. Maybe they're not. Maybe next year when we get this same reports, they won't have any of this stuff in it.
It'll look a lot different. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I guess that's
to your point,
the bright side, that maybe they have turned the corner on this stuff.
That they can tell a story that they might have turned the corner, but to your point, it's hard to tell the story that they did so rapidly, right? This has been a brewing and ongoing scandal for quite some time, and they restated their financial statements a few years ago and admitted to some wrongdoing in the sense of LaPierre reimbursed the organization for some certain costs, and so this was what the cause of it is, I don't know, but it was a pretty reluctant change. Whether who's reluctant in making the change, I'm not sure, but it was a reluctant change. But at least they're at the point where they can say we did make noted changes, and like you said, if next year they say ever since the new executive vice president came in, and ever since the new board, we haven't had any of those issues. They can at least tell a story that it's a different organization in the way that it's run. Not that they have a different mission, but just the way they operate is different. And to the extent that members were turned off by the way that they used to operate, then, not only will they have more resources at their disposal than they used to have, but they have a story they can tell that to those donors or members that, our spending practices, our financial controls, and our policies are all different.
Yeah, I mean, it does remind me a bit. I guess the question is whether they've done this fast enough, right? They do have this different story now. They have a lot more compliance I mean, this compliance report is the result of this trial and the NRA's attempts to reform itself. They have a chief compliance officer. They never had something like that before. Then they resisted making those changes for years during this scandal. But they did survive. They didn't meet the worst case scenarios of this trial, right? The dissolution of the organization was something the Attorney General in New York tried at. The appointment of a court-directed overseer was another thing they tried at after dissolution didn't work. They didn't get those things. They did get, some court-ordered reforms like this chief compliance officer role being more protected. But they still have taken 6-7 years to get through. Maybe we're at the end of this scandal period, right, is kind of what we're seeing the beginning signs of, perhaps. But it does remind me of, a couple other very well-known nonprofits that went through similar scandals, maybe different scale, but Susan G. Komen Foundation and the Wounded Warrior Project both had corruption-related scandals, misspent money, or at least money spent in a way that donors did not like. I don't know that they ever raised quite to the level that the NRA got to, but the Wounded Warrior Project, for instance, they spent donor money on retreats for the staff that people felt were too lavish for a charity that is supposed to be helping wounded veterans, right? And that created a big scandal for them at the time. They're obviously a very well-known national organization that's, I think, on scale, money-wise, was similar to the NRA at its height. And they, in about 6 months, fired the people who were responsible for that and brought in new leadership under the promise, from outside, under the promise that they were going to clean that up. And it took them several years, but they did rebound. They did eventually get back, and now I believe they've surpassed the level of fundraising that they were at before the scandal. Susan G. Komen, on the other hand, a little bit different scandal. It was kind of politically charged, had to do with cutting off donations to Planned Parenthood, but also had a corruption element to it, misallocation of charity funds for the founder and CEO of the organization. She resisted efforts to reform for, I think, a year plus, and then they've never been able to recover. They're about half the size, last time I looked, of when that scandal first broke, and that was like 10, 15 years ago at this point. So I don't know. Do you see parallels there? Are there any other maybe charities that you look back on their ordeals and see analogs to the NRA?
Yeah, I mean, there are some similarities there. Also, some differences that I would keep an eye on. I mean, similarities, as you know, very well-known, publicly visible organizations that have all the organizations you mentioned also heavily reliant on lots of donors, not one or two big dollar donors.
Right.
And so public perceptions are really important to them. So those are kind of the similarities. The things that I would say are a bit different with the NRA, which a little bit slower in response, not a little bit. They were slower in coming up with a solution to this. Or what is ultimately what they've done was a slow burn to get there. But some other differeces which make it where, like you said, if you think of one as being a few years later, they bounce right back to where they used to be, or even bigger, versus you kind of settle into being half the size you used to be. Which of these paths or where in between the NRA falls? A couple other things to think about there. Both of those organizations you mentioned arguably grew a lot faster than they were prepared to grow. They both became very popular, very fast, brought in a bunch of money, not necessarily prepared to spend that money that quickly. And so, the Wounded Warrior Project grew so fast. I mean, I think even people within the organization would say they weren't prepared for how popular they were going to get. And so some of their practices hadn't caught up with the size that they suddenly got. The NRA is not that. The NRA has been around for so long. And so, we can't say the scandal came about because they weren't prepared for all the money that suddenly came to them. That makes it a little bit harder to tell the story of how you reverse that problem, right? And the other difference is the one that we've talked about, which is, the NRA is a membership organization. It's known more because of its 501c4 and its more political activities, not for being charitable, though it does have that charitable arm. Whereas, Wounded Warrior Project and Susan G. Komen, I think, in many ways, their proposition was they offer a mission that everyone is on board with. And that means everyone's going to donate to them unless there's a controversy, in which case everyone kind of falls back. And so they saw huge changes because in many ways, their sales pitch was everyone is on board with this. The NRA obviously has a very particular angle, and they have benefited over the years from being controversial or being provocative. So, the fact that they were in the news and it was controversial for a long time, they pushed that as we're being attacked because our views. And so, I don't think those other organizations would have ever been able to take the position that us being provocative is what we want, right? And so I could see that the NRA might had a different stance, that being provocative has worked for them over the years, and part of that is their goal is to push a particular viewpoint, and so they don't want everyone to agree with what they're saying or doing. So I guess those are the two things I would keep in mind, that the NRA doesn't have to convince the entire general public to donate to them. What they need is to convince people who really care about their cause to get back on board with them. And that could be easier for them. And
interesting.
But I guess we'll see. We'll see where they fall in that.
I mean, certainly they have a huge pool of people who used to be NRA members that they can now go with this new message to and say, hey, come back,
True. And I'm sure they know who all those people are as well. So,
yeah.
So there's going to be a natural group that they can reach out to. And it doesn't have to be an organization that's beloved by the entire public. It needs to be an organization that's trusted by those members who used to be there. And so it might be a different approach.
No, very good points. And really appreciate you coming on and sharing some of these deep insights into what the NRA's report, financial reports are showing us, and why maybe there's some reason for now, for maybe the first time in a while, for hope that for NRA supporters, that the group is actually going to make a turnaround, or at the very least, stop the decline that they've continually been under. Completely agree. That it's still not clear what their new normal will be. Yeah, but it's not destined to be shrinking anymore. It could be a larger organization than it was in 2024. And that'll be the first time, if they pull that off in 2025. That'll be the first time in 7 years that they've done that. So, that is something that we will stay on top of course, and continue reporting on. And we'll hopefully be able to have you back on the show when we have some more financial documents to go over, is to get your great insight on this. For people who want to follow, your writing or your work, where can they do that?
I'm on Blue Sky at Counting Charity. Find me on LinkedIn. But otherwise, I happy to talk with the NRA with you anytime. And I really appreciate your reporting on this. I know you've been at the forefront for a long time and very objectively looking at their financials and their circumstances.
Well, thank you. And I appreciate you trying to do the same, as far as, you're focused on the financials of the group and what they say, and not on what whether you like their politics or don't like their politics or what have you. So I appreciate that you're able to come on and give us that expert insight. So we will look to have you on again in the future once we have another story like this. So appreciate you doing this. But that is all we've got for this week. If you want to keep up to date with what's going on with guns in America and the NRA in particular, you can head over to reload.com and sign up for our free weekly newsletter today, or buy a membership to support this kind of reporting. That is how we fund our reporting, through our membership dues. I own the company. that's where our revenue comes from. Members, we're accountable to our readers, not to advertisers or gun companies or the NRA or anybody else. So head over and sign up for a membership today. And of course, you'll get this podcast a day early, and you'll get access to hundreds of pieces of news analysis you won't find anywhere else. That's all we've got. We'll see you guys again real soon.